So I'm our co-host. I'll be moderating this poster session, and we have a total of 50 minutes for this session. And we have, I think, 6 speakers. So each speaker will have about 2 minutes to present their poster, and then we'll have 5 to 6 minutes per speaker for question and answers. So the first speaker that we have is Zack Dulberg. So if you can
Yes.
share your screen. Yeah.
Sure. Hi, so I'm Zack. I'm a family doctor and a fifth-year PhD student working with John Cohen at Princeton University. And I'm going to present to you a model of grieving that we came up with. And I'm going to race through some slides in 2 minutes. So basically, there's a lot of grief going around in the world, and it's a strange behavior. We're not the only ones who do it. And so our question is, like, what's good about grieving? Why do people engage in this behavior? In other words, how can we better understand the human grief response? And so we did that by using reinforcement learning to model an agent that grieves. And so I'm going to show you 2 videos here. On the top, there's going to be a classic agent that just learns directly through its experience of the world. And on the bottom is an agent that replays painful memories as if it was grieving. And on the left, you can see the agent running around in the world where there's a big reward on the top left and a small reward on the bottom right. In the middle, you can see the value that the agent is learning about. So it learns that there's a lot of high value in the top left, just as you would learn the sources of value in your world. On the right is what direction the agent would want to go. That's its policy. And in a few seconds, you're going to see the agent experience a loss. So you can see that in the top left, that yellow square went away. And now, if you look at the difference between the 2 agents, the one that's grieving, that's replaying these painful memories, it's sort of wiping away that value in the top left of its screen.
Zack, sorry to interrupt you. You'll get extra time, but I don't think we are still seeing your first slide.
Oh, you can't see the video?
No.
Okay, let me try to share again. Okay, can you see this the screen here that says reinforcement learning simulation?
Yeah.
Okay, and when I press play, do you still see the same screen?
You are seeing the same screen, but nothing is moving if it's supposed to move.
Is it moving now?
No.
Okay. So if that's not working, I will just continue on to the next slide. Can you see the next slide?
Not yet.
How about now?
No.
Yeah, your entire screen is locked.
I'm sorry.
Let me see if I can reshare.
Do you have it somewhere else, like on Google Slides or something?
I just have this keynote presentation. How about now? Can you see a new set of slides?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you see any video?
Yep.
Oh, you see it moving now?
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to waste too much time, but if you remember the description, basically an agent's running around learning about sources of value. And when one of the sources of value goes away, replaying painful memories of the loss allows the agent to move on and find out new sources of reward, basically getting back to its life. And since we're probably over time, I'm just going to give you the key points here. So the first is that grieving helps the agent increase its reward. The second is that grieving, when your state space gets really large, it helps scale to larger worlds. And the last thing that's also interesting is that it produces waves of negative mood. And so in our model, if you can see this pink curve with oscillations, we basically get waves of grief emerging from our model. We can ask really interesting optimization questions also. For example, we can ask, how painful should grief be? How sensitive should the agent be to the pain of grieving? How often should the agent dwell on its loss? and how long should grief last? And we can look at individual differences and similarities as we change parameters here. And lastly, we can also look at human data. So for example, on the left is human data for grieving trajectories for different attachment styles. And on the right is our model's attempt to reproduce these trajectories. So a lot of more connections in our paper about modeling grief phenomena like anticipatory grief, emotional expression during grief recovery, and even relief. So use this QR code to check out our preprint. Thanks.
Thanks.
And yeah, sorry the video didn't really work.
It eventually worked out, so great. We have about 3 minutes for questions, if there is questions for Zack.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hey, this is Cole. Yeah, I really liked your research. I think this is pretty cool. I was wondering here, is grief just like the summation of losses or penalties up to like some temporal time point? And like, how does that influence, are you using like a reward policy or a policy model? And how does that influence that policy model?
Yeah, so if I can, I'm just going to go back to the video. You know, maybe while I'm answering questions, can you see it playing now? Okay, good.
Yeah.
So basically, there's only two sources of reward in this world. There's, you know, that high reward in the top left and the medium reward in the bottom right. And grieving is just a process by which, when a loss is experienced, the agent replays that memories of that reward, but instead of rewarding memories, it replays painful memories of that reward. So it kind of like multiplies by -1. And so it's doing the learning, but in reverse. So it learned all this massive value, and then it has to unlearn it in order to move on with its life. And that's why the grieving is a process. And if you're asking about the mood, we just calculated mood based on previous literature as like a running average of prediction errors.
Very nice. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have about 1 minute left, so if there are any quick questions. Okay. If not, then I guess we can move on to the next speaker. Thank you very much, Zack.
Thanks.
So next we have Nicole Detoro. Is Nicole here? I guess not. So I guess we can move on to the next speaker and circle back to Nicole later on. So next we have Andrew Cutler.
Hey, can you hear me all right? Okay, so is everybody seeing the full screen of the poster? Is that okay? Perfect. So the question that interests us is, can a LLM serve a conversation about depression? And then can you use natural language processing to score that conversation about depression on a number of scales that are traditionally used? So scales like HAM-D, MADRS, PHQ, and so on. And so the system we built, if you use it, you'd see something like this. So this is our character, the virtual assistant, Tyler, and he's animated, and he speaks the words that the LLM generates. And then he can be interacted with either by voice or text. So you can see you have this window over here where you can talk to Tyler, the assistant. And then we take this conversation. This conversation takes about 20 minutes. It walks through different facets of depression. And then that conversation is scored on HAM-D, MADRS, PHQ, Beck, and MDQ. And for this study, we actually didn't use humans interacting with this bot. We actually defined a set of patient bots, and we had LLMs simulate them. And so we had bots talking to bots. We generated 24 different conversations, and we rated those each on these 5 outcomes, and showed that for each individual conversation, the test-retest is about what you'd expect in real life. So from the literature, we know that HAM-D and MADRS correlate about 0.7, and in this data set, they did as well. You can also just have an LLM simulate the same person over and over again, and we found similar test-retest. And so this, if you wanted somebody to do the paperwork to score each of these scales, it would take about an hour. This conversation takes 15 or 20 minutes, so the time is quite reduced. And it also produces the scales immediately. And so those are some advantages of this method. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions people have for the next few minutes.
Thanks, Andrew. That was almost perfectly timed. Yeah, so we have about 5 minutes for questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have a question. I was wondering, what are the kind of application you can think regarding this kind of, we know that the healthcare workforce is overwhelmed. So kind of like, what are the possible applications that we could have of Tyler, for example? Can we access it, or will it be available, or some stuff like that?
Yeah, so you can actually access it and test it out there. We have a demo online. As far as the lowest hanging fruit, so in research studies, a lot of times there's graduate students who are giving the MADRS or HAM-D. They don't have all that much training. Sometimes it's even undergrads giving these. I think that the bot can do as well as undergrads giving this. There's also just a couple of, so sometimes there might be a question on a questionnaire that says, do you ever experience mood swings, or are you ever very happy and then very sad? And some people will say, well, yeah, like my sports team, they threw away a game and I was very happy, then I was very sad. And the bot does a good job of asking for examples of the behavior when people answer. And so there have been some cases where it's better at disambiguating than the paperwork would have been.
Thank you.
So we have a few questions in the chat asking if we can actually access the virtual assistant.
Yeah, go to platform.sama. That's enough on my web to get it. If Shobi gave it right there. Platform.sama.ac. Yeah,
thank you for sharing the link. We have another question. Can you please share or say more about your process for creating simulated conversations?
So say more about what process?
Sorry, can you please say more about your process for creating simulated conversations?
Yeah, so if you prompt a bot and say, for example, this is your backstory, and these are the symptoms you're experiencing, it can do quite a good job. I mean, I was surprised at how good it can do of just answering everything in this conversation. So that took some iterations. The first, when I was trying to instantiate that at the beginning, it didn't work great. But once you got a system going, it did a really good job. And the scores were really very close to what I intended in the original design of the bot. So I was happy with that process.
Okay, and we have another question. Why simulated conversations versus conversations with real patients?
So it's easier to get simulated conversations. That's the answer.
Okay. Thank you. We have about 2 minutes left. So if there are any other questions.
Hi, Andrew. I want to ask, how is the patient bot simulated? Do you just use prompt engineering, or do you fine tune on anything?
So that's just prompt engineering, that part.
Okay. So do you have a process to validate the patient bot that is doing what they need to do?
Yeah, so that's qualitative. So looking and seeing if the responses are reasonable. So the other validation, if you look at the results part, the HAM-D and the MADRS scoring are independent. And so there's completely different models which are doing the scoring. And so the fact that it can take a conversation and then give it a similar score in both HAM-D and MADRS. So from the literature, there is a mapping between HAM-D and MADRS. And if you use the mapping, it's as accurate as if you had done the mapping on human scores scored by humans. And so at least the scores have a lot of the same statistical properties as as real humans.
All right, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andrew, for answering all the questions and for your talk. So next we have
Okay, thanks.
Oliver Toscano.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to share my screen real quick. So this poster presents one of the studies from my undergraduate senior thesis. What we did here is we collected 48 different messages, which simulated responses on crisis hotlines. Half of the messages were collected from human crisis counselors, and the other half were generated from ChatGPT 3.5. The idea was to compare each of the different writers on the empathy of their messages while controlling for the length of the messages. So that was measured by word count. And we wanted to see if the length was moderating the relationship. So we had these messages rated blindly on their perceived empathy. This was a representative sample of US adults with an N of 364 using Prolific, which is an online data collection platform. And after an ANOVA analysis, we found two main effects. So the first was that the longer messages were more empathetic than shorter messages. And the second was that ChatGPT messages were actually more empathetic than the human messages. And while that ChatGPT message difference was statistically significant compared to the human messages, the effect size was actually negligible based on like typical cutoffs for Cohen's D. So some takeaways here. We can see that generative chatbots may have a role in text-based conversations that require empathy, whether on hotlines or not. And perhaps what is more immediately actionable is that that finding that length is moderating this relationship between the writer and the empathy of the message. Because what that's telling us is that even in situations where users or patients aren't necessarily consenting to chatbots in their care, we can improve the empathy of human-based messages by finding ways to lengthen them. So with text-based crisis hotlines in particular, you can have the issue of it taking a long time to type out a much longer message, and you want that message very quickly. And so, for example, something like a voice-to-text feature for the counselor's end may help them write longer messages without sacrificing the timeliness of their messages. There's a lot more to say on this, but I think that can kind of be the basis for questions that people have them.
Okay, thanks. So before we go into questions for Oliver, there's a question for Andrew, if how Andrew can be reached. So if you can like respond back to them, that would be great via the chat. So Oliver, we have a question for you. Do raters know whether a message is from human or a bot?
No, so we did this study as blind ratings, which was mostly so that we could compare to previous studies that had made this comparison. I will say that one of our kind of attention checks that we ran at the end was just asking them to say what they did in the study, just writing it out shortly. And some people, I believe it was about just under 5% of people, just unprompted mentioned that they thought chatbots were part of the study. So it was definitely on people's minds, but it's unclear whether or not they were actually identifying the chatbot messages as from chatbots or the human messages as from humans, because half of the messages that all participants saw were from humans and the other half were from chatbots. So, yeah.
Okay. Another question we have is, how do you measure empathy?
Yeah, so we didn't use a particular scale. It was really just kind of a quick definition of empathy based off of how well the message was making the imagined user feel understood. And just, again, representative sample of US adults, just letting them make their own interpretation of what empathy was. And the idea there was perhaps it was more externally valid to just see how people felt it. It was.
Okay. And we have another question. Great study. Do you plan to peer review and publish in the near future?
Yes, there are plans to do so. Like I said, this was my undergraduate senior thesis, so it's just, I've just graduated. That's part of the plan, but yeah.
Okay. Then Jonah asks, is there any U-shaped relationship to length of messages being less empathetic? After a certain point, do longer messages become less empathetic at all?
That's a great question. So in the methods here, you'll see the mean word count for kind of the short message conditions was around 38 or to 40, depending on if it was humans or ChatGPT. And the longer messages, the word count was all the way up at kind of mid 90s. So those were the only two options for length that we tested. And you would definitely need to do further research on this to have more length intervals to be able to see if there really is that U-shaped relationship. But it's a great question.
Okay. Another we have is, how did you determine the length of a long versus short message?
It was just based off of word count. So for the ChatGPT ones, part of the prompting was telling it to write a response of a certain sentence length. And with the human crisis counselors, they were given the same sentence length. I had a bunch of messages and we found the word count for all of them and found a combination that allowed us to control for the length. So that the human and ChatGPT messages on short were not statistically different. But then across writers, there was a statistical difference between the short and long ones. Yeah.
Okay. Rachel has shared an idea. It would be interesting to do a follow-up evaluating where raters, after providing an initial rating, are informed whether the response is from a chatbot or a human, and then ask if they would change their rating.
This is a great point. And I will say, after I had completed this study, there was a separate study that was published. I'll direct you to this reference right here, Yin et al. 2024. So that's down here. They actually did pretty much that. They weren't looking at empathy per se. They were looking at how well the message made the user kind of feel heard. But they did find that after the raters knew that the message was AI, the increased ratings dissipated. So it is a very good thought.
Okay. We have about 1 minute left. So if anyone has any quick questions. Oh, Zhuan Zhao says that the California Online Transparency Act requires that the bot discloses its identity upfront. So it sort of circles back to the first question that she had.
Yeah, so I think obviously with any use of chatbots in care, there should be that consent upfront. So the chatbot disclosing its identity and then the user consenting to it or not. And I think the work with non-blind ratings, so people rating the messages when they know it's AI, is probably the next step in seeing if there is that use. Because if people don't want to use a chatbot, then there's no reason to develop them in this case, I guess. But I do think that, again, the finding that length is moderating the relationship even for human writers is definitely something to keep in mind when people, again, aren't consenting to chatbots in their care.
Okay. I guess the comment is more from an ethical perspective, because there was, I'm not sure if you are familiar, there was a big controversy about one of the chatbots that, I'm sorry?
The NIDA hotline, the National Eating Disorders hotline?
No, it was before, at least the one that I'm talking about was before that, but we can discuss that later on. So thank you, Oliver, for your presentation and answering the questions. Next, we have Hoshue. Am I pronouncing that right?
Josue, yep.
Joshua? Okay. Go ahead.
So, do everyone see my screen? There is a presentation.
It says has started screen sharing, but I don't at least see any presentation yet. Oh, now I see it.
Okay. So just give me 1 second. Wait. Just give me 1 second. I am sorry for that. Yep, so that should be good. So, hi everyone, my name is Josue. I'm a sophomore at Dartmouth College, working with Professor Karen Fortuna at the Guy's School of Medicine with other amazing people. So the goal of this project was to build an algorithm that could provide accurate feedback rather than relying on human feedback to improve the quality of care for peer supporter. So previously, a first step of the project was when we were able to gather some data, transcribe some real conversations, some therapy session. We were able to get some data, transcribe them, but there were a lot of issues. We only were able to get like 1,700 sentences. There was a high imbalance in the classification of the sentence. Like 70% of them were high, 30% of them were low, and also those sentences were really short. And there was a lack of data because it is really hard to access real patient data. So here was the problem we were faced with, and we tried to go to solve that problem by using data augmentation technique. So basically, our main question for this study was, can we generate LLM sentences so that they are as realistic as human-generated sentences, real sentences? And we did. So we had this survey, we had an LLM, we had a prompt generate sentences based on some profile, like the peer supporter profile, the therapist or the patient profile, and the topic of the session. We generated around 10,000 sentences. And then we wanted to validate our findings. And we created a survey that we shared with peer supporter and computer science professional to see if they will be able to distinguish between the AI-generated sentences and the human sentences. And as we can see on the screen, computer science professional and peer supporter cannot reliably distinguish between LM-generated synthetic sentence and human-generated. So that allows us to be able to use those sentences that we generated for the training of our model. So initially we have 1,700 sentences. AI model necessitates tens of thousands of sentences. There are a lot of to do. We receive feedback on Facebook. Some people are skeptical about using AI in the peer supporting field because people are afraid of losing the human connection. And our next step are going to generate more sentence, retrain our classifier, and increase our amount of data by transcribing other audios that we have. And yeah, thank you. And I'm looking to hear any of your questions.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. What do you mean by high fidelity and low fidelity?
Yes, exactly. So basically, in the research we've been doing, we use different criteria to define two categories of sentences that we can define as high and low fidelity. So in the context of peer support, if someone comes to me and talk to me about one of their issue, and I tell them, let's say the person is talking about eating disorder, and I tell them, just go to the gym, right? So like, for example, or I would tell them, oh, for me, or I will make everything about me. That will be considered low fidelity. High fidelity would be suggestion, listening to the person, asking questions so that the person can express their emotion, and just widening the scope for the user. Low fidelity is mostly like directive actions, like you should do this, you should do that, it because of you, and those kind of things. And I don't know if that helps answering that question.
Thank you. We have another question. Are different models, different closed models and open models equally good?
So for this study, we base our generation on the latest model of GPT. So we use GPT-4 Turbo, the latest version of GPT at the time. And we did not test with open source model regarding generation. In our to-do list or our next steps, we are trying to use open source model like Llama 2 to try to rate the sentences, so high and low fidelity, given some criteria that we are going to give them. And I see someone mentioning GPT-4o. By the time we were generating those sentences, GPT-4 Turbo was the latest version. GPT-4o came like a few weeks ago, and we already did the data generation by then.
Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. I think we have another question in the Q&A. What implication you may see with the current finding?
Can you come again, please?
What implication you may see with the current finding?
So with the current findings, the implication are we will be able to actually train a much better classifier. Our initial classifier was trained on imbalanced data and a small amount of data, 1,700 sentences. Now with the finding that we figured out that, okay, we can actually use synthetic data to increase the size of our data set, we'll be able to actually generate thousands of sentences so that we can get a better classifier.
Okay. Thank you. We need to move on to the next speaker now. Thanks a lot, Joshua. So next we have Laura. Laura.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Sorry, I'm still seeing Joshua's screen. Can you please stop screen sharing?
I think I just overwrote it. Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Thanks, Coco. My name is Lara, and I'm a postdoc at the Center for Behavioral Intervention Technologies at Northwestern University. And I'm going to be walking you all through my poster, which is about the uptake and usage of a publicly available automated text messaging intervention for affective symptoms in adults. A little bit of background: we all know that depression and anxiety are common, but many are unable or are uninterested in formal mental health treatment. Automated text message interventions are a promising and scalable solution to this treatment gap, but engagement remains a major barrier to implementation in real-world settings. So the aim of this project was to characterize user engagement with an automated text message-based intervention called Small Steps SMS in the wild. And just a little bit of background about Small Steps. It's an 8-week automated SMS-based intervention with content rooted in evidence-based psychological strategies like behavioral activation, relaxation, self-compassion, values, etc. And then the content is delivered in a variety of dialogue types. So these include long prompts, which provide people with psychoeducation, a suggestion for something to try, and then it follows up with them after about how it went. But also stories that give people stories of other people struggling with similar things, grab bags, which are short prompts about a variety of topics, and then writing prompts where people are invited to write messages or advice to other people going through similar struggles. And Small Steps was made publicly available through Mental Health America's free screening tools. And anyone who was interested was invited to try Small Steps and this work was completed under a waiver of consent. So very quickly, people were engaged in the study for about 38 days and responded for about 21 days. People wrote about 55 characters in each message on average when they were invited to write like a lengthier message. People responded about 15 times and the response day rate was about 28%. I'm already out of time, but just like the overall conclusions are that engagement was greater than expected, especially given the unselected sample. We also did some work looking at the correlates of engagement in terms of age and mental health distress. And so younger users and users with greater distress were less engaged overall. Users were most engaged with content around increasing social ties, engaging in pleasant activities, and being kinder to themselves, and also most with dialogues that included opportunities to explore diverse content, read peer stories, and offer advice to others. Further work is needed to better understand how to engage younger users and users with greater mental health concerns. Thank you so much. I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thanks, Laura. We have about 3-4 minutes for questions for Laura. We have one question. Great presentation. Interesting to see that younger users were less engaged. Did you have a chance to explore why that was?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We don't really have data around like maybe qualitative data or something like that around why younger users might be less engaged. It's possible that they are just, I don't know, like less interested in talking to the bot, or you can kind of see here that actually age and psychological distress are negatively correlated. So younger users are also more psychologically distressed. So that's a follow-up analysis that we'll probably do to see if the distress explains the relationship between the age and the lower engagement.
Brittany is asking, curious to hear if you looked at how different types of engagement related to outcomes, symptom improvement or worsening, or behavioral change, likelihood of returning to the app.
For sure. Thanks for that question, Brittany. So we don't actually have any outcome data from this publicly available deployment of this intervention. So all we kind of have is their baseline Kessler distress inventory. But one thing that we will be looking at is in these long prompts, I mentioned that people are asked to, or not asked to, but prompted to try out something related to the psychological strategy. So like for behavioral activation, they'll be prompted by the bot to do something that they think might lift their mood, for example. And so we will be looking at whether engagement is, for example, related to whether they do or don't actually do the thing that the bot suggests. And then we'll also be looking at whether engagement is related to satisfaction. So they get questions every few days on whether they found, the strategy helpful or not helpful and stuff like that.
Yeah, we have another question in the Q&A, though not related to the focus of this poster. Does more engagement relate to more reduction in symptoms?
Yeah, I think that's the question that we wish we could answer with these data. I don't I can't answer that with the data that we have right now. I think the idea is that if you engage more with the intervention, that we're hoping that leads to better outcomes, but we know that that's not always the case, and we can't say in this specific study whether that was true.
Okay, and we have one final question. Good to see you and really interesting presentation. Curious about the types of dialogue. Could you share a bit more about what the stories and grab bag content consisted of?
For sure. Hi, Cody. Yeah, so the stories, so those dialogues provide users with a variety of different stories that are kind of about other people who might be struggling with something similar. So like the bot will ask, like, are you struggling with being lonely or something like that? And then it'll tell a story about someone who might be struggling with a similar loneliness issue yeah, so hopefully that explains that. And then the grab bag are just these quick sort of back and forths about how they're feeling that day, just like different, I guess, content that are not even necessarily related to a psychological strategy. So kind of just different, I don't know, yeah, different content like that.
Okay, thank you. So we missed one of the speakers initially, Nicole Detoro. So if you are available to speak now, or anyone from their team. No? Okay. So we have one final question for Laura, if you're still interested in answering. I thought we would have the other speaker, so I skipped that.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, so there's a question, do people have more symptoms at baseline engage more? So do people who have more symptoms at baseline engage more?
No, so we actually found the opposite. So people who had greater baseline symptoms were less engaged in general over the course of the study. So engagement was negatively correlated with, or no, I guess it's positively correlated with more symptoms. It's like more symptoms, less engagement.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I guess we have about 8 minutes left of the session. So if there are any questions for any of our speakers, then we can have them now. Or if I missed any of the questions during the sessions, you can ask that now. There was one comment that I missed from Shobi Ahmed for Joshua. Great paper, Joshua. I see parallels between the implications of your work and Oliver's. What you term high fidelity seems analogous to more empathic, longer responses, which enable further engagement by patient. Okay, so if there are no further questions, then I guess we can end the session now and meet at 1:10.